The following video is a segment from a much longer video. If you want to go directly to the main video and watch it in full, then you can find the link to that in the description, plus right up here in the card. Enjoy. Can Jesus talk about the future? So right here on the timeline, in Capernaum, Jesus said that he will give food. He said that he will give his flesh, which is true food. And since Jesus said he will give it, that means that this is going to happen in the future. Now in John 6, we're not told when this is going to happen. So it could have been 2 seconds after he said it, a few months after he said it, a whole year after he said it. Again, John 6 doesn't have Jesus telling us when he's going to give it. We're just told that he said he will give it, which means it's going to happen at some point.
And the bread also which I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. This is put into the future. Doso is the Greek term, but I will give. Not I am, I will. It's in the future.
Oh, good. So even Mr. White, who knows the Greek, agrees with us. When Jesus says will give, he's talking about the future. Now, as we looked at in part 1, Mr. White thinks that this future event is referring to the crucifixion.
This is looking forward to the cross. This is looking forward to the cross. The bread also which I will give for the life of the world is my flesh.
So when Sade reads John 6 and they hear Jesus saying that this bread that he will give is his flesh, they think that he's talking about the Last Supper when he takes a piece of bread and then he blesses it and gives it to him saying, "This is my body." But as for Mr. White and others on side B, they read about how Jesus said there's a bread that he will give which is his flesh, and they believe that he's talking about dying on the cross.
And the bread also which I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Now he's talking about giving up his life.
He is going to give his flesh for the life of the world. How did he do that? You remember that cat of nine tails when Jesus Christ was being sent to be crucified? They ripped the flesh off of him. He gave his flesh. He is not giving his flesh as bread to partake and eat literally. He is talking about, I will give my life for the world.
So the sides disagree as to what the future event is that Jesus is talking about, but both sides agree that will give means that Jesus is talking about something that's going to happen in the future. So now that we know all that, let's hear from Mr. White.
Let's say you're flying someplace, taking a bus someplace, taking a train someplace, going on a cruise, whatever it is, and maybe you're sitting there and you've got your Bible open, and you get into that conversation, and you end up in John chapter 6 talking with a Roman Catholic. Run a little program back in your mind as you are reading these words. I am the bread of life. The Roman Catholic is thinking the wafer, the consecrated host in the Mass. And you might go, wait a minute, even if that were the case, the Lord's Supper hasn't even been established yet. Well, that's true. That's true.
Okay, so according to Mr. White here, as you're reading the words, I am the bread of life, the Roman Catholic is thinking the wafer, the consecrated host in the Mass. Now, why might it be that a Catholic Christian on side A would think about the Mass when hearing the words, I am the bread of life? Well, as we've discussed earlier in the video, it's not just because Jesus said, I am the bread of life. It's because he also said, if anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And he followed that up by saying, the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. And then he went on to teach a bunch of stuff about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. And he also mentioned that his flesh is true food and his blood is true drink. Then, a little further down the timeline, at the Last Supper, Jesus takes bread and he gives it to his disciples. Again, this was happening after Jesus already said he was going to give them bread. So he gave them bread and he said, this is my body. And just in case it slipped anybody's mind, in Capernaum he said that the bread that he will give is his flesh. So yeah, one of them Roman Catholics might be thinking about the Mass when they hear these words, but not just because of these words, but because of all of these words and all of these words. And also, all of these words. Jesus can turn water into wine, why not bread into his body? Or wine into his blood? But anyway, I digress. Mr. White seems to think it's strange that side A thinks that this teaching from Capernaum was about the Last Supper. And he poses this argument. He says, you might go, wait a minute, even if that were the case, the Lord's Supper hasn't even been established yet. To which Mr. White says, well, that's true. And you know what, Mr. White? That is true. When Jesus was delivering this teaching in Capernaum, the Lord's Supper hasn't even been established yet. At least not established in time. The Lord's Supper easily could have been established in the mind of God. God could have known it was coming. But chronologically speaking on a timeline, the teaching in Capernaum happened here before the Last Supper. But what's your point, Jimmy? Do you think that Jesus can't talk about something unless it happened already? Because in John chapter 2, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So here we have Jesus talking about destroying a temple, and that happened at this point in time, but the event that he's referring to actually happened at this point in time. So according to the Bible, Jesus can talk about the future, and even according to this theory that Mr. White has about the crucifixion, Jesus can talk about the future. So again, Mr. White, what is your point?
The Lord's Supper hasn't even been established yet.
I've got 7 reasons why we ought to read the Bread of Life discourse as a metaphor. The first is because just contextually, historically, the Eucharist hasn't been established at this point in time. When Jesus is actually preaching the Bread of Life discourse to the people there, the Eucharist had not even been established. The Eucharist had not been established yet, so that cannot be what Jesus is talking about.
Why not, Mr. Brooks? Jesus can talk about the future. Everyone on both sides believes that Jesus can talk about the future. So why are you saying that the Last Supper cannot be what Jesus was talking about? Jesus knew about Judas betraying him before it happened. Jesus knew what he was going to do on the day he fed the 5,000 before it happened. Jesus talked about rising from the dead before it happened. Jesus talked about his ascension before it happened. According to the Bible, Jesus can both know about and talk about the future. So why are these guys from side B acting like this would be an issue?
If you were raised Roman Catholic, that's what you were taught. You are actually eating the body and blood. Now that is not what Jesus means here. How do I know that? I know that, number one, because he has not yet instituted the Last Supper, communion, at all yet. And he won't for another couple years. So for him to say this at this point would be a nonsensical statement to anyone listening, even his disciples.
So it's not clear exactly what the argument is here, but Skip is either saying just flat out Jesus can't talk about the future, or he's saying that Jesus can't talk about the future if it has the potential to sound nonsensical to somebody. Either way, it's a load of crap. Skip, first of all, Jesus can talk about the future. So if you're flat out saying that he can't, that's wrong. Now if you're just saying that he can't talk about the future if it has the potential to sound nonsensical to his audience, that's also wrong. Jesus talked about rising from the dead. He talked about ascending into heaven. You think these things don't have the potential to sound nonsensical to somebody? This argument from Mr. Heitzig is garbage. But so many people on side B make this argument.
We love our Roman Catholic friends, but we seek to give them the gospel. And I would tell you this, there's 3 reasons why Jesus is not referring to the Lord's Supper here. Not at all. A.W. Pink writes about this. Number 1 is this: the Lord's Supper or communion has not yet been instituted. Jesus is not talking about that because that doesn't happen until much later in his ministry.
I'm going to read this comment from Arthur Pink. This is what Brother Pink had to say. He said, "This passage in John 6 is a favorite one with ritualists who understand it to refer to the Lord's Supper, but this is certainly a mistake, and that for the following reasons. First, the Lord's Supper had not been instituted when Christ delivered this discourse. You know, it wasn't until the very end of his life that he instituted the Lord's Supper. Hadn't even been instituted yet."
Okay, so here's the problem. Did you notice that both Jeff and David cited the same guy? A.W. Pink, Arthur Pink. Arthur Walkington Pink lived from 1886 to 1952. And apparently during his life, he came up with this argument. Now I'm going to guess that most of you watching right now, if not all of you, now understand that this argument makes no sense. I'm going to guess that Jeff and David would even watch this video and say, yeah, that argument doesn't make any sense. So why is it that this argument from over 70 years ago is being shared today by these two guys? Well, that's because they trusted Arthur Pink without testing him. If you test out this argument, it takes 5 minutes and you realize, okay, that's stupid. I should not get in front of a crowd and say that. I definitely shouldn't record myself saying that and then post it online for everybody to see because, again, this is a really dumb argument and I don't want my name attached to it. But now David and Jeff have attached their name to this argument. And why? Because they trusted Arthur Pink without testing him. This is why we always say when it comes to us or these people on side B or your teachers or your pastors or your parents or your friends or talking dogs, hello, when it comes to anyone teaching you Christianity, don't trust us, test us. Now I'm really curious to hear what James from Study is Key has to say about this, because in part 1 we talked about side B's teaching on John 6:63 and how that was stupid, and James, even though he's on side B, agreed with us.
One thing I do want to say right off the bat, and we'll see this as I go through the video, I agree with Ferris that Protestants often make bad arguments from John 6. I think that side B's typical interpretation of verse 63 stinks.
In other words, Jesus is saying that the true meaning behind the metaphoric language and the figurative language is that it pertains to a spiritual dynamic, not a physical one. It is not physical.
Yeah, so I'm not going to play the rest of these clips, but basically all these other Protestant pastors go on to make similar points from verse 63. And Ferris is absolutely right to call them out on this because it's a terrible argument. I got to put it bluntly, it's a dumb argument, and I wish that Protestants would stop making that argument because it just makes our position look weak, or at least weaker. And also, obviously, I mean, this is part of verse 63, I guess, so I don't have to mention it, but since I've started talking, I'll mention it. When Jesus says that the flesh is no help at all, he's not saying that his flesh is no help at all. That is absolutely stupid, so please drop that. I use that language very intentionally. It is stupid. Please stop using it. I'm being even more harsh than Ferris was on you. Stop using it. It's stupid.
So that was great to hear. Obviously, James is still on side B. He's still making arguments for side B, but he acknowledges that a lot of people on his side are doing something really dumb with that verse. So James, if you're watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this argument from side B, because it's so ridiculous, yet so many people make it.
This is John 6, long before the Last Supper, the crucifixion and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. This is John 6. This is long before Jesus gives that Last Supper where he breaks the bread and gives them the wine. This is long before then.
Jeff, it doesn't matter how long before the Last Supper Capernaum happened. Jesus could talk about the Last Supper in Capernaum, because Jesus can talk about the future.
Yeah, so I'm more than happy to put my "this is a stupid argument" stamp on this argument about how John 6 cannot be talking about the Lord's Supper because it hadn't been instituted yet. Jesus specifically said, "The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." So there's no chronological issue here.
All right, so again, that was just a segment from a longer video. If you enjoyed this segment, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click that notification bell and all. And again, if you want to watch the full video where this segment came from, you can click the link in the description, or actually the link should be appearing in the video right now. This is How to Be Christian. You all have a great day.